All right, this is another Jay's Analysis podcast. This time I've got something a little bit different. It's been a while since I've had a debate. Listeners and readers will remember about 3 years ago there was a debate with Turretin Fan, but I decided it was time to bring it back. The audience loves debates. They get a lot of attention. So what I want to do now is present a debate between Darwinian evolutionary theory and what I would call basically just a theistic refutation of that view. And so I'm going to have a friend of mine, Joshua, and Josh is going to give an introduction for himself. We're buddies that met on Facebook, and he's also a student of philosophy. So Josh, go ahead if you would and just give an introduction and tell us a little bit about yourself, what got you into philosophy, natural sciences, and so forth.
Well, I'm really just somebody who thinks too much. That's pretty much all there is to it. I don't have any particular college education. I'm just a working guy. But in my spare time, I just absorb information whenever I can, and I'll come to strange ideas of my own, you might say. So, yeah, I just enjoy reading and writing quite a bit. Haven't published anything yet, but have a few books in the works. I'm 20 years old. Have a lot to learn, but just doing what I can.
All right, excellent. So, but you are a fellow student of philosophy. We don't really care here about the state education system in terms of how much state education you've had. That's not a big deal.
Good.
Yeah. So for listeners, the way the debate's going to work, basically, we're going to have a three-part presentation and response with crossfire. It's going to be somewhat of a loose format. We don't have to obey necessarily time strictures. Preferably neither opponent would, spend an hour on their argumentation or something like that. But we're going to do the first part will be is Darwinian evolution a science? Josh is going to present that. I'm going to do a rebuttal to that, and we'll do a crossfire. The second part will be the philosophical questions about Darwinism regarding the ethics, the epistemology, and metaphysics in regard to Darwinian theory. And the third part will focus on the impact of society in terms of Darwinism. What's been the social impact of that worldview? So without any further ado, Josh is going to open us up, and he's going to give, as long as he likes, as a presentation on his defense of evolutionary theory, and I will be the opponent.
All right. Well, I listened to your two lectures, your two the videos you did online, Darwinism Deconstructed and Darwinism Annihilated. And, there's a lot of good things in it, good observations, but I disagree on a few things. The first one, I think the most important, or the one that I guess most qualified to speak on, because would be the statement that Darwinism has no predictive power, which is really what defines it as science. And this is, a lot of this information unfortunately hasn't been presented to the public very well. Most you watch a documentary on a Nature Channel or whatnot, it's all very, very elementary and glossed over. But I've looked into it, and I'm not an expert, but I believe that it completely passes the test as far as a valid theory, because it meets the qualification of predictive power. Now, so really there's two spheres that it does that. That's in things like geology and the fossil record basically, and then there's genetics. So the first thing I'll try to keep it brief, but I'll go over the geology aspect first. The missing links have been found. It's that simple. There's always going to be gaps between fossils, of course. We don't have every single species that's ever existed. But, Darwin hasn't vindicated. We found fish amphibian forms. We found reptilian mammals, feathered dinosaurs, ape humans. So we have a pretty good, complete transitional spectrum. And it's actually so fluid that it's hard to fully... It's so fluid and full of trying to classify. There's debates over, is this a dinosaur, or is it a bird? It's like they don't know because it meets each observation so well. So that would be my first argument. Now, we don't find things like mythical chimeras in the fossil record. We found specifically you found like a Pegasus or a griffin or a mermaid or a cherub?
If I don't mean to interrupt you, but if you could just, you're talking a little fast, so it's kind of giving a little feedback on my end. So,
Okay.
I didn't hear that last part about what you said has been found.
Oh, has or hasn't been found. I was talking about dinosaurs. I think I was talking about dinosaurs.
Okay.
Birds.
Birds. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't understand what you said. Go ahead.
Yeah, so also, again, I do have a problem with talking too fast. But, yeah. No, we found so many, I'll just go back a bit. Basically, we found so many species or specimens that are hard to classify because they have both attributes, of what we would call different, what a creationist would call kinds. But these are not chimeras. Like a chimera would be a Pegasus or a cherub or a mermaid or a crocoduck, which is informed by creation as something we have to find. If we found those things, we would disprove evolution because those are outside the spectrum of Darwinian theory. So there's a sort of fluid flow of transition. Now, on top of that, when it comes to the geological aspect of it, these creatures are found in a certain order. They're found in migratory patterns, migration moving across the two-dimensional surface, and in the time scale strata. So it's a three-dimensional view, really, of a story that's being told pretty consistently. Not that there's never anomalies, but the pattern is still definitely there. Now, when it comes to genetics, this is probably actually what I'd say is the strongest evidence because, well, when you put it with geological evidence, it's much more powerful. And the reason why is you mentioned in your lecture that homology, the comparison of the forms of different organisms, isn't enough in of itself to say that they're related. Which I would agree tentatively, but I can see the point there. Where the punch is in genetics. So we have things like ERVs or endogenous retroviruses, and all that basically means is when a virus comes into an organism, a host, and alters its DNA, that alteration is permanent, and it will be passed on to its children. And so, same way that we would prove, like in the court of law, paternity, or looking at any other genetic matter, it's built around these genetic markers, and tracing them back to the original source. So we share like 16 of the exact same genetic markers with chimps, which for that to be a mere coincidence, it's astronomically near impossible. The only way these things get transmitted is through reproduction. Unless we share a common ancestor with chimps, there's no reason for us to have these exact same viruses in the exact same point in our respective genetic codes. So, once again, it's a probability thing, but I think it comes to as close truth as you could really ask for. And the reason, once again, that's more than just a coincidental fact that kind of just fits in evolutionary theory. The reason it's predictive power is because this fact was discovered. These ERVs were discovered specifically to test evolution because scientists said if we're related to chimps, we'll find this, and they did. And so there's tons of other examples of genetics, similar. We have other shared mutations. We have another interesting fact about how chimps have, well, not chimps, but apes in general, to my understanding, have 24 chromosome pairs. Humans have 23. And that was a huge problem for evolutionists because if we, for one, as far as mutation goes, you can't just lose an entire chromosomes. Sorry, what was that?
I didn't say anything.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
If we were just to lose, evolution doesn't work by just like dropping an entire chromosome. The organism would basically die. So it was impossible. So that was a big problem for evolutionists because if we had lost an entire pair of chromosomes, we wouldn't be here. So that's going to be the explanation. So scientists predicted that if we were related to apes, it would be that the chromosome discrepancy would be because two chromosomes in an ape fused together. So they looked specifically to find if we had, chromosomes that fused and bounded. So, and once again, those chromosomes are correlated directly to other ape chromosomes in terms of their size. They're of course, the genes are going to be different because they're two different organisms, but the similarities are overwhelmingly more than differences. So it's it's things like that personally has me convinced that evolution is a completely valid science because it has predictive power, especially when it comes to genetics. They use it to classify pathogens and to cure disease, so it has social application. Saves lives. So I guess I'll put it there and let you. I have tons more I can talk about, but I'm not just going to run on a science lesson here.
Well, no, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, you need to feel free in your opening defense. That's a good basic defense of what you think are the strong points in the theory. But I want you to feel free, to expand on any other issues that you see backing this up. So don't worry about the time constraint. You've only gone for 8 or 9 minutes.
Okay, I'll keep going then. All right. Well, so I talked a bit about how in genetics it has predictive power in testing. The same goes for the fossil records. Not only do they find organisms or specimens that fit into the tree of life, they can use the tree of life to find new organisms. So, for instance, the fish to amphibian transition they were looking for, that was really important. Moving from land creatures to land, it's a pretty big leap. And so they knew they needed evidence for that. And they used evolution, what they already knew about the fossil record, to pinpoint exactly where it would be if it existed. Because, like I said, the fossil record is kind of a three-dimensional, crystal ball, you could say. It's a model. And, and they can use that to find where new organisms are. And that's how they found the fish to amphibian form called, I think it was called phtalic or something of that nature. And once again, it meets all the specifications of both a fish and an amphibian. So that's one aspect. And I think it's important to think of evolution as an interdisciplinary study. It's really, the real strength of it is how all these different fields are kind of telling the same story. There's these overlaying patterns where they can look at, for instance, they can either look at the genes of an organism and compare it to another organism and predict similarities in morphology and taxonomy, or vice versa. They can look at taxonomy and say these organisms look the same, so we'll probably find these genetic similarities, and they do. So, but that's more of the scientific aspect of it. Then when it comes more to Darwinism, because that's really what we're talking about here is Darwinism specifically, I think it's important to just kind of note that Darwin didn't even really think of evolution himself. It was more providing a mechanism for it. Evolution had already been pretty much proven in terms of paleontology, finding new layers of life, and the question was, how did these new things arrive? Most of the prevailing theories were ideas that, that every once in a while God would basically, upgrade the system, kind of dramatically. But that wasn't naturalistic, of course. So they needed something else because they were naturalists. And Darwin provided that. Now, and this gets more into the naturalist, the metaphysics of it all, but I'll keep that for later. But basically, Darwin came along and provided a scientific explanation for why this happens. And I think it's important to remember that Darwin didn't think about, didn't invent evolution. He contributed something. But the reason the reason I believe that his work is enduring, he's kind of, he's survived he's kept in the public consciousness is because he was actually one of the most scientific and naturalistic thinkers of his time. A lot of his contemporaries were pseudoscientists, especially when it came to things like race and eugenics, and we'll get into that later. But his naturalism, I think, has been vindicated. We've observed what's often called microevolution. We see that all the time. We know that speciation does occur through natural selection. So that's basically it. I'm pretty convinced of that. And if you have alternative facts, then I would be willing to change. But I've never heard a good opposing scientific theory for this data, which there's really only one scientific interpretation for the patterns we see. And I think I'll close it there for now.
Okay. Thank you for that, and thank you for coming. Again, I wanted to thank you for being here. That was a good explanation. Most of that is stuff that I've understood. Just to let everybody know, my focus historically has been philosophy of science. That's an area that I'm pretty fluent in. That being said, I did have in my academic career, quite a bit of exposure to Darwinian theory in science classes, in philosophy of science classes, grad classes, and so forth. So a lot of what Josh said, I had heard. There was a couple things I was not familiar with. I've got a bunch of notes here, so I definitely want to begin a response. So I would like to start with logically what I think the problem here is, because the claim is that Darwinian evolution constitutes a science. So my initial query would be that this really depends on what we consider a science. Science, as we know, is not something determined by the mass opinion of scientists. There have been, of course, plenty of scientific revolutions in history. The famous work of Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, shows that scientific revolutions happen in much the same way as political revolutions. And so what happens is actually a complete paradigm shift. So in other words, it's important to understand that the prevailing opinion on some certain view does not, of course, determine science. And of course, I'm not saying that Joshua is defending that claim, just that merely because something is considered the norm or considered prevailing opinion or, quote, science, it does not necessarily mean that it's true. I just need to get that out of the way as we progress, because, of course, Darwinian theory is the ethos in which we swim in our day. The reason that I do not think it qualifies as a science is because of, number one, the nature of science and scientific inquiry and the scientific method, what its scope is, and the claims that Darwinian theory and theorists tend to make and have made. And so rather than, when we look at something like the scientific method, we have hypothesis, we have, evaluation of the evidence, and then we come to the conclusion as to whether our tests vindicate this hypothesis or not. Because of the nature of science, it is an inductive study. It's something that can only reason from the particular to the general. So you're always going to be confined to one scientific or one specific example of some phenomena or event. So if I'm going to study the earthworm, I'm always going to be involved in studying a single particular earthworm at one time. I mean, I might have 50 or 100 earthworms in front of me, and I may do 50 or 100 tests, but because of the nature of the human mind, I'm always going to be confined to, in the scientific method, studying a particular instance or phenomenon. And therefore, any time that a scientific theory begins to go outside of that boundary and make claims about large metaphysical truths or grand narratives of origins and meaning and where we're going as a species, I think it then begins to step outside of its boundaries in terms of what, quote, science in the norm defines science as being able to do. That does not mean that a grand narrative or a totality explanation of cosmogony or cosmology or the origins of life is necessarily wrong. It simply means that on the assumption or the presupposition of the scientific method, grand narrative claims, large scope metaphysical claims and epistemic claims, etc., don't qualify as meeting the parameters of the scientific method. Now, I don't want to necessarily get too much into the philosophy, but I did want to make a point that when we are going to argue that Darwinian evolution counts as a science, obviously the immediate question there is, well, what exactly is science? My understanding being the scientific method is what classically defines science and scientific inquiry. So when you moved on, you began to talk about excuse me, that it has predictive power. That was something that you brought up a few times. The first thing I would say about predictive power is that predictive power is something that, again, is based on induction. To be able to make a prediction and then, in terms of probability, having that prediction come true, requires quite a bit of metaphysical baggage that goes outside of the parameters of the scientific method. That does not mean that the predictive claims are false. It simply means that science in this regard is still limited to working on some kind of system or some kind of logical structure that is not itself the subject of scientific inquiry. So when we have something like predictive power, again, we're assuming the principle of induction. Generally speaking, Darwinian theory tends to be empirically based, and science tends to be empirically based. Empirically based sciences are not and cannot give any kind of explanation or answer for the principle of induction, which is, of course, that the future will be like the past, that we can reason from the particular to the general. Why? Because those are not empirical truths or principles. You went on to talk about geology and genetics. You said that the transitional forms do exist. There are many of them that implying that the creationist account simply is not aware of or glosses over the masses of evidence of transitional forms. My response to that would be very simply that what constitutes a transitional form is, of course, based on one's presupposition and interpretive framework. So simply because we have one form or skeletal structure in a fossil that appears to be something in between two other forms does not necessarily constitute the transitional form. Now you may say in response to that, well, then you're just hedging your bet as a creationist and you're going to say that nothing constitutes transitional form and you're just being irrational. No, I'm simply saying that the question of what constitutes a transitional form is itself also an interpretive semiotic question and not merely a scientific question. A good example, again, being when you made the point that the homologies, you agreed, are not necessarily a complete proof of Darwinism, but that they do stand in some kind of evidentiary, sort of support of Darwinism. So if you agreed with the principle that homologies themselves do not necessarily constitute a complete proof of Darwinian of evolutionary theory, then it would also be the case that transitional forms and the interpretation of those forms constituting a transition also do not themselves form a foundational proof for Darwinian theory, unless you want to argue that somehow transitional forms do form a foundational theory evidence, yet homologies do not. But to me it seems that the interpretation of transitional forms and homologies is essentially the same act of the human mind trying to interpret these different, forms. Next, you said that dinosaurs, so forth, do evidence different kinds. So you do agree with the creationist classification. In other words, you do agree that there's a classification. I'm aware that creationists talk of kinds, and the taxonomy is a little different. You speak of species and so forth. That's all fine and well. My question at that point would be that if we speak of different kinds or different species, what we immediately engage in there also is a question of assumed objective distinction. In other words, which means this still assumes that we can objectively classify something out there in the world as being distinct from this other thing when it comes to biological life. That requires also quite a bit of metaphysical assumption and speculation. And while I don't intend to immediately launch into the metaphysics aspect of it, that was something that did stick out because, as I said, we had the issue with the argument from induction when you speak of predictive power. And this, yet again, is a question of patterns. When you say that there are migratory patterns a 3D story is told from the fossil record that we can, clearly get a big crystal ball picture of. That is all well and good as long as we have some explanation as to how we're able to do such a thing. In other words, how do we explain, given that worldview or given your worldview, how it's possible that we can have a grand interpretive framework or narrative by which we can speak of things as being like a crystal ball pattern. When you spoke of the genetics, moving on, you mentioned the DNA alteration. You spoke of the 16 genetic markers that humans share with chimps, and you spoke of the chromosome pairs, 24 and 23, and the argument there being that the similarities between these two, genetic markers and so forth, therefore clearly show that there would be, of course, some kind of common descent. Now, taken in itself, I don't necessarily think that that constitutes a proof my way or your way, simply because that also is based on an assumption. It's based on the assumption that there is not a creator who could create humans and chimps with similar chromosomes. I mean, we can see examples of other animal patterns, of other animal DNA, such as between, say, a lizard and a chimpanzee, which shows quite a vast bit of difference, and yet or between a human and a chimp, even if it's only a few percentile, obviously the differences are quite vast. So in other words, a small percentile difference in these structures itself is enough to show a vast difference between those two types of life. Moving on, I would say that when you talked about the fossil record, it's my understanding, and I will of course try to present sourced evidence below the post if need be. It's my understanding that there have been, according to different studies of ice structures, which are supposed to be dated in these different periods that are supposedly millions of years apart. There are actually large frozen trees that should be from a single certain period that actually extend back to periods of millions of years, Paleolithic and so forth, that tree should not exist in. So in other words, it's not necessarily the case that all the quote studies and scientific evidence proves that we can have no life that doesn't transcend these sort of arbitrary boundaries of what constitutes these million year and multi-million year aeonic periods. I would also add that when you spoke of the tree of life, and then you talked about taxonomy and genetic similarity, you spoke of the Darwinian mechanism that was provided. The mechanistic view, in my view of Darwinism, is precisely its weakest point, because once we go down the road of mechanistic presentations of nature, we will be presented with a host of philosophical problems, several of which I will bring up in the philosophical structure. But I do want to note that most of what you've argued for does confirm a lot of what I will present in that philosophical section of the debate. I would also say that I'm glad that you confirmed the view of natural selection, and so I will save that as well for the philosophical section. But in closing, again, I would recap that the reason I don't think that it's a science is because what will constitute a science based on one's assumptions or presuppositions will condition and determine what one thinks the evidence supports or negates. So if I think that phrenology is a science, I'm going to do my scientific investigation with rose-colored glasses. I'm going to study skulls under the assumption that skulls will teach me a certain thing. That itself does not prove or disprove truth about skulls, but it does show that phrenology at one time was considered a science. So when you made the point, and this is crucial, what I'd like to stress here, when you made the point that the predictive power of this theory is what gives it its strength, I would say that it's entirely possible to have erroneous presuppositions and still make correct predictions, even on assumptions that conflict with other presuppositions. So in other words, there might be a tribe somewhere that does not know anything about, say, advanced mathematics or even basic mathematics, yet they might still be able to correctly put together, 2 and 2 equaling 4, without knowing necessarily anything about mathematics in some vast, in-depth way. So in other words, results do not necessarily prove that the assumptions or presuppositions of some grand narrative that step outside the boundaries of the scientific method are correct. All it shows is that certain presuppositions within that person's worldview or within that system or scheme are able to make predictive, accurate statements. So I'll close with that.
Yeah, I guess at this point we've kind of moved into epistemology, it seems like, more or less. Totally fine. So I guess dealing with the nature of assumptions and consistencies and whatnot, you're right that Darwinian theory depends upon the assumption that certain things have been constant. That is an assumption, but I think it's important to note that's pretty much the assumptions that all science makes, meaning things like our belief that the Earth goes around the sun. We predict. We know that we're going to experience an equinox because we've experienced it so many times before. And so when you said that you can't be absolute proof of predictions in the future or the past, things we haven't experienced yet. It's correct that as far as what would qualify as absolute proof, then again, it's questionable whether or not there's such a thing as absolute proof. But so when it comes to assumptions, I completely agree that Darwinism has assumptions, but I don't believe that those assumptions go outside the realm of what all science does. Meaning, once again, looking at taking the data we have, and this is something that I think is lacking. I think Bill Knott kind of dropped the ball on this, by the way, in the recent debate. He didn't. I think he did bring the science. He didn't bring the big in on epistemology because he's not a philosopher. And so when it came to the matter of assumptions, he didn't really acknowledge that they're making assumptions. But an assumption is not a bad thing. But we all have to make assumptions every single day. But you told me that the assumption is there are certain constants.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to say that my argument wasn't that Darwinists make assumptions. I don't. No, I was saying that Darwinian theory, right, makes an assumption. Everyone makes assumptions, but what I was saying is that the assumptions don't line up with its other assumptions, and the conclusions of those assumptions, I believe, go outside of the stricture of what the scientific method allows. Go ahead.
Okay. Could you give me an example of what you see as a conflicting assumptions?
No, yeah, I've got a whole bunch of those listed, and I'll save that for when we get into the specifics of the philosophical point.
Okay. I'll look at that then. Okay, well, I'll just keep going down other start points. I hope I wrote them all down. But when it comes to things like homology, and genetics, and how comparisons are not in themselves, Ramon said that comparing two organisms isn't absolute proof they are they're related. I heard I first meant that, but it's not to say that once again within the scientific method, and I still interested in what you have to say as far as there being a contradiction within Darwinism. But it goes back to basic things like all of science is based upon a naturalist view, which I don't conflate with actual hard naturalism or scientism. It's just the basic fact that science is concerned with the material world. It's a material concern, correct, but we take the data we have that we've confirmed to the best of our ability, and we construct something with it that is used to predict. And Darwinian theory is definitely more complex than Newtonian physics, for instance. But even Newtonian physics still has these basic epistemological assumptions. And that's so that's why I'm pretty. That's why I believe that Darwinism still qualifies as a science. Now, as far as the narrative aspect you bring up, which is interesting, there's some people who have said that Darwinism or evolution in general is better described as a sort of historical perspective.
As a what? Could you restate that?
As a historical narrative, as opposed to scientific narrative.
Okay.
And that's interesting because it kind of shows where narrative and theory kind of like overlap. And all narratives are theories. All theories are narratives, more or less.
Right.
But
yes.
that classification isn't very helpful, of course, when deciding if something is scientific or historical. But I think that's kind of where where our understanding of human epistemology kind of where two worlds collide. Where discerning is a science or is it history? But then again, all of science is based upon history. It's based upon accumulation of data over time, a recording. So of course it's historical, and but by contrast, there's the so-called science of history. Historic history itself, in that field, is even more prone to mythological aspects. You might say, even I personally think even greater biases. Not to say once again, not to say that science doesn't have biases and assumptions, but history itself, is once again written by the winners. And judging a scientific theory, I think should be based. The judgment should be based upon does it follow the scientific method? And I haven't seen any evidence that Darwinism violates the scientific method. Now, that doesn't prove it's true, but in terms of judging it as a scientific theory, I think it stands. Now, the epistemology and you brought up Darwinism, it doesn't explain how we're able to construct these crystal ball views of the world and whatnot. It provides a slight insight. I mean, Darwinism talks a bit about the development of the human brain, but you're correct in that it doesn't provide a view of things like reason, why reason exists, why consciousness exists, do we have souls and whatnot. So that's definitely true, but once again, it's not the job of Darwinism to explain that any more than just saying that chemistry can't prove or explain why our brains are able to come to these conclusions or to reason outside of the box metaphysically and whatnot. But that doesn't change the fact that our brains are still chemical organs, and so naturalism has definitive value there in helping us understand human psychology. That doesn't mean it can explain everything. Some people would say it would. I don't consider myself from that extreme scientist camp. But I think it's important, once again, if you're going to judge a scientific theory, to ask, does it follow the scientific method? And I think that should be the basis of judging it as science. That's pretty much it.
Okay. Thank you for those clarifications. The next question I have would be a couple pretty straightforward ones. You said that, excuse me, right away the biggest thing that stands out is that you said that Darwinian theory, scientific method, etc., cannot provide the metaphysical answers on questions of soul, consciousness, etc. That's not its duty. It doesn't have to. Well, my question very simply at that point would be, on what basis and on what criterion do you know what things constitute metaphysical and non-metaphysical, or scientific or non-scientific? I mean, in other words, how do you have a benchmark by which to gauge what things are not under the purview of metaphysics? Because my understanding of metaphysics and my understanding of any kind of even knowledge claim at all immediately requires quite a bit of metaphysics. So, in other words, I don't mean to jump into the philosophical aspect, but I can't help but point out when you say when you say things like, well, science doesn't have to do that, it doesn't have that duty. science is only concerned with naturalism, materialism, and the material world. But the material world and material forms are metaphysical. So, how do you delineate what counts and what doesn't?
Yeah, no. When you said, I didn't say that science is not under the purview of metaphysics. It is.
Well, you said you said that it is not concerned with answering those questions.
Well, not primarily, because it's looking at mechanistic. It's looking at mechanisms fundamentally and documenting them, and then predicting what the mechanisms can do in the future.
Okay, but aren't mechanisms metaphysical instruments in some way?
They are in some way, yes.
Okay, so it is concerned with metaphysics.
Of course, it's concerned with it. My point was simply that things like the nature of the soul, but we've never found the soul.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, how do you delineate which things are metaphysical, like souls and don't count, and things like mechanisms, which are? How do you delineate those two?
Yeah, sure. No, just things like immaterial things. This comes back to things like.
Okay, so it's only material things. How do you know that what counts in the scientific world, or as scientific verification or evidence, is only the material things?
Well, in terms of what it can observe, I mean, of course, the scientists use reason to make assumptions, and there's also philosophy that goes around it. My point is that fundamentally you're dealing with matter, and this also goes back to the question that I think there's a real problem in science. The question of, is it possible we could derive a better method than a scientific method that could help us understand metaphysics and the material? Once again, that's where our own language is tripping us up. Is that here I am saying metaphysics versus material, and I'm not trying to say that materiality has nothing to do with metaphysics, as if there's a clear cut line between them. No, they're obviously highly related, highly interconnected, possibly even the same thing. My point, though, is that material science, judging I'm trying to say it's more a matter of when this is like Platonism, basically. Plato was dealing with things like ideas, things beyond what we can immediately see, and he was correct that there are things beyond our perception, the numbers and values and principles at work that you can't put into a bottle.
Okay,
and I totally agree there.
Right. Yeah, you're right. But you spoke of probability is the way we work. Is probability material?
I wouldn't say so. I think it transcends matter.
Right. So it's immediately utilizing something that is not material. Would you agree that that probability is what's used in the scientific method and in induction?
Oh yeah, we use it. Of course
Right.
we use it.
Okay. So it's immediately concerned with something metaphysical.
Oh, of course it is.
Okay. But again, these lines are getting a little gray, a little blurry here. I'm getting unclear on exactly what things count, because if probability is what we use, the tool by which we use to study the material world, then the tool itself is something metaphysical. Yet I understood you to say that we're not concerned with metaphysical questions at the point of scientific inquiry.
No, I think this would be apply metaphysics to the material to understand the material better. Does that make more sense in the sense of it's not a matter of Darwinian evolution disproving that there are metaphysics, or Darwinian evolution being, I don't see any way in which it is contrary to metaphysics. We use metaphysics to understand the world. They were active understanding it.
Right, but I understand that. But earlier, I wrote it down. You made the statement that it's not concerned with proving or disproving metaphysical things. And what I'm trying to get at is that when you make a statement like probability, or when you make a statement like the material world, those are metaphysical claims. Probability.
Right, but Darwinism doesn't prove probability. That's my point. Probability in mathematics and these higher concepts.
Well, we're not talking about what it proves. I'm referring to when you said that it's not concerned with those things, but it's using those things.
Okay, yeah, sorry. When I said it's not concerned with it, all I meant was that Darwinism is not what we use to understand probability. In other words, if you apply probability to Darwinism, Darwin. You see what I'm trying to say? It's metaphysical. That's the point. It's meta. It's beyond. That's what we used to rely on.
Correct. Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was a misunderstanding there. Cool.
Okay. But you did say that empiricism is the basis of knowledge, correct? That human knowledge is based on empirical evidence, and that's where we derive knowledge from the material world, correct?
Well, no, I'm not a hard empiricist, but my point is that the scientific method does rely. I'm not going to make the same mistake of poo-pooing or putting down metaphysics.
Okay, no, that's fine.
I'm just bringing up that empiricism is really integral to science more than really any other field.
Correct, and I would agree. I just wanted to make sure, get a clear idea of what your view of empiricism was. Okay, so that helps. Do you want to go ahead and we'll move on to point 2?
Alrighty.
Okay. I have in my notes that I'll go first here, and then you can launch into your crossfire and examination. To begin with, I would say that the philosophical school that I will be defending is known as transcendental philosophy. This deals with presuppositions and webs of beliefs. So when it comes to the question of truth or truth claims or knowledge claims, I believe in what's called a coherence theory of truth, and that is basically put that the way that we know things are true is that they are placed in our web of beliefs, and it's kind of like a superstructure or a web. We have grounding foundational beliefs and presuppositions that condition the rest of our beliefs. In other words, if I believe that God exists, then my foundational belief in God will then condition how I interpret statements about the physical world. So, as a creationist, one would believe that matter is created. If matter is created, then the interpretive framework by which one will approach matter and phenomena in the world will be vastly different than those who believe that it is not, or that it is some kind of emanation, or that it is some kind of just eternal flux state of change. A transcendental argument, simply put, is an indirect form of reasoning and argumentation. Aristotle is the first to make a transcendental argument. He argues that when the sophists come along and question the law of non-contradiction, A cannot equal non-A, the only way to prove the law of non-contradiction itself is by an indirect method or a transcendental argument. So it becomes a meta argument in that it transcends direct, immediate, inductive perception. There's no way to empirically prove or disprove the law of non-contradiction, simply because it's not the kind of thing that we prove or disprove empirically. So the way that we will prove or disprove different types of things depends on the nature of different types of things. In other words, not every kind of argument will go to prove the same type of thing. The way that I would prove the lifespan of an earthworm is not the same way that I would prove a mathematical problem or a logical problem. They're two different types of proofs. In that regard, when it comes to questions of foundational presuppositions or beliefs, those things govern our entire worldview and function like rose-colored glasses and give us an interpretive framework. Now, simply because we have an interpretive web of beliefs and transcendental presuppositions, it doesn't follow that our presuppositions are wrong. It doesn't follow that our worldview as a whole is wrong. And it also doesn't follow that specific predictions or beliefs or ideas or claims of knowledge that we have are right or wrong. It's simply a statement about how I believe, and I can defend, I think, human epistemology and worldviews work and how they're structured. So my first issue with Darwinian theory and evolutionary theory is that, again, because I do believe that science is limited in its scope, simply because it is an empirical form of argumentation and approach, which you did agree with, it is prevented from, again, making grand narrative claims that go outside of immediate empirical evidence. Now, you tried to clarify that. I don't think that, from my vantage point, I heard, I understand how you clarified your position, but I don't think that it got to the point of my objection, which was simply that Darwinism still makes grand metaphysical claims, even if you or any other Darwinian theorist doesn't want them to be grand metaphysical claims, such as things like probability, such as things like we study only matter, or, clearest of all, the strongest argument is simply that the scientific method itself and induction cannot be proven or known through the scientific method. So, in other words, we're dealing with something that is utilizing principles, utilizing conditions or preconditions that are metaphysical and epistemic, and ultimately ethical too, that are not and cannot be known or proven by the argumentation or by the inductive empirical approach itself. Now, you may not have a problem with that, but I'm simply saying that, again, we are utilizing something that's a presupposition that we don't have any way of explaining based on the other presuppositions of Darwinian theory. Now, you may not want to give a vast metaphysical explanation for, the totality of reality and so forth. However, what you may or may not want does not necessarily mean that when you make a statement such as that, such and such animal is, extends back to the Precambrian period, or when you say something like the earthworm exists to be, has a however many days lifespan. Though you may not, want those to be metaphysical claims, by necessity, unfortunately, they are packed with a host of metaphysical claims. For example, one of which is that the earthworm is distinct from you. Another would be that the earthworm has some sort of identity over time. These are philosophical questions that are presupposed in the act of science and cannot be proven or disproven by the scientific method itself. Now, you may say, well, I don't have a problem with that because I'm not concerned with proving or disproving those kinds of things. Well, again, when we start with science and empirical investigation as the determining rudder of our worldview, there is no way that we're going to have an answer or can answer or explain any kinds of foundational, presuppositional, metaphysical questions like this. So, proceeding on, I would say that number one, in the Darwinian view, and again, all of my critiques may not necessarily be the totality of your view, because I don't exactly know your view of every single point. So feel free to, when my little spate here is done, feel free to step in and qualify or clarify whatever points you find to be incorrect or that you disagree with. If everything that we experience is essentially just what's been here, in other words, if reality itself, created reality, as I would believe, quote, creation, if it does not have a beginning point in time and a middle point and at least some sort of telos or end point, then what we have is essentially a static form of reality, a static form of being or metaphysics, in which ultimately, because of the cyclical nature of things like a time, in other words, if we make time eternal, if we say that what is has always been, it will always will be, then what we end up with is some kind of Maya or illusion view of reality, because change ultimately ends up being non-existent or illusory. Ancient Greek philosophers such as Heraclitus actually came up with the same view, who in a way was also evolutionary in his view. He came to the conclusion that change is illusory because everything is flux. So if everything, I'm sorry, let me correct that. Zeno made the point that everything is illusory because you could infinitely divide any point in time. So if you could infinitely divide any point in time, then the appearance of something moving or changing is impossible because it's infinitely moving. Heraclitus, of course, is the grandfather of all the evolutionists, as well as the atomist philosophers, because they believed that everything was in constant flux. I'm not saying that you believe everything is in constant flux, but in other words, if we don't have some sort of fixed metaphysical principle of beginning, middle, and end in terms of time, then change, I believe, becomes ultimately illusory. And if a change is ultimately illusory, then the scientific method itself is a waste of time and impossible. Moving on, the argument I would make from numerical and logical entities. If Darwinian evolutionary theory is correct, we need some kind of a counter-explanation or basis for how the Darwinian theorist is using things like probability, using things like logical truths and principles in order to formulate the very theories that he says ultimately makes everything in flux constantly. So, in other words, if the scientific method is based on probability and the principle of induction, the future operating like the past, we need some sort of account of how or why you believe the future will be like the past, how or why you accept the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, etc., etc. These are logical entities, invariant and immaterial, that do not come under the purview of Darwinian theory. And even though you say Darwinian theory is not concerned with that, we want to know how you're able to use those things on your presuppositions, regardless of whether you find them troublesome or whether you think that Darwinian theory doesn't have to deal with that. No, you do have to deal with that because you're utilizing things that we want to understand how they work within your worldview. I believe, I'm almost done, I believe that my worldview as a theist perfectly makes sense of and is coherent, gives a coherent web of beliefs that explain how it is there can be things like the principle of induction. Because God is personal and He's provident, He is the reason for the future being like the past. Moving on, oftentimes Darwinian theorists, when they speak of nature selecting or nature providing, etc., or nature causing, they are actually engaging in a form of fallacy where they are personalizing and attributing actions that are appropriate only to a rational agent to something that is impersonal. So in other words, impersonal forces, it does not make sense to attribute personal attributes to them. Now, I understand that most Darwinian theorists do not believe that there is an active personal agent behind the process of natural selection, the process of increased complexity and so forth. I understand that, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, on what basis do you make a metaphysical claim that that some force chooses, or that some force causes or does or selects? Again, that very idea presupposes some sort of rational agent. And I understand, again, that that is interpreted merely as just a sort of figure of speech. But it's a figure of speech that presupposes telos, or purpose, and that's my point. In the Darwinian worldview, generally speaking, we are unclear, we have no explanation of how there is such a thing, objectively speaking, as telos or purpose out in the world. Darwinian theory engages in a tautology. Tautology, of course, is a logical problem because we are told that when we ask, well, who are the fittest? The fittest are those that survive over time the evolutionary process. When we ask how it is that those are the ones that survive, the answer is given that they are the fittest. This is a tautology because it's unfalsifiable. In other words, Darwinian theory presupposes Darwinian theory in order to justify the survival of the fittest. Moving on, Darwinian theory does not have an objective unifying metaphysical principle. Thus, it must fall into either monism or dualism. And what I mean by that is when we make the human mind the highest form of consciousness or source of meaning or source of predication, then the human mind, which is finite, which is subject to flux and change, is also unable to objectively predicate anything that can stick to what's out in the objective world. When I, as under this worldview or theory, make a statement about the cat being red, 5 minutes later, due to the nature of constant flux in the world, we do not know if that is actually still true. I mean, even though I may be observing it, the meaning of that statement does not seem to carry over time. So, in other words, the question of identity over time and the question of some objective unifying principle that is able to link all of these different claims, such as that the earthworm lives to be however many days old. That presupposes that this is some sort of truth that all the other earthworms share. Josh spoke about taxonomy and kinds or species. Well, that assumes that there's some sort of unity between those objects out there in the world that we can link in some way. But if that linkage is only a token of human linguistic terminology or human social interaction, then it's not objectively the case that one earthworm has any similarity or relates to any other earthworm out there in the world. It's simply a human token term or symbol, which of course over time turns out to mean not much at all, due to the metaphysical belief in constant flux or change. Next, I would say that when we consider the Darwinian claims about the age of the Earth, there's a problem here. The scientific method does not give you an empirical basis for what the age of the Earth is. Yes, one studies different layers of strata of rock, fossils and so forth. However, again, this is an interpretive framework based on all kinds of assumptions as to the actual number of those ages. And I'm aware that that number changes and different theories evolve and different theories change and there are different hypotheses. But the founding assumption here is simply that it is, billions or millions of years old. Again, the origin of these things, the past, is not something that is empirically studied or verified. You cannot empirically study the past. The scientific method also, again, cannot be justified or verified through the scientific method. So we need to know why should we believe in the scientific method? On what basis is that something that we should believe in? I believe in the scientific method. I believe that it's a tool at arriving at truth. But I believe that it is so because it works on things like induction that makes sense within a worldview where there's a God. Darwinian homologies, as I said, and as you dealt with, are an interpretive framework, and you did agree with that. You agreed that yes, it is, but that's okay because science does need to do the work of interpretation of these different forms. Well, there's a problem with that because interpretive frameworks are a question of epistemology. They're a question of semiotics and the philosophy of signs or symbols. That is loaded with metaphysics and epistemology and is not something, again, that can be verified through the scientific method. So in other words, even if we didn't want to say there was a grand narrative claim about Darwinism, it really wouldn't matter because even if you attempt to make a simple claim about the similarity between the zygote and the similarity between some amphibian or reptile, that alone involves a vast semiotic network of interpretive symbols and philosophical metaphysical baggage, all of which is completely unexplained or unaccounted for in the type of worldview that's being presented on your side. Naturalists are also guilty of the deterministic fallacy, and I am closing up pretty soon here. The deterministic fallacy or the naturalistic fallacy deals with causation. I don't know your view on free will or individual action and consciousness, but when one adopts a materialistic view, or even if one doesn't believe in materialism but adopts some sort of idealistic monistic view or solipsistic view, it is still subject to the same problem of the deterministic fallacy. Stated simply, the deterministic fallacy is that if every action is merely a determined sequence of events or mechanistic processes that are determined by prior events and causation, then there can be no free will. So this means in effect, that when Josh is arguing with me, if he adopts that position, that means that the chemical reactions in his brain that are firing, causing him to make the argumentation, are merely a series of predetermined chemical reactions that occurred in the past, causing his present chemical reactions. If that's the case, then Josh is not actually making an argument. All that's happening is chemical reactions are happening in his brain, and chemical reactions are happening in my brain. There's no actual conscious choice of argumentation and right or wrong. It's just simply atoms firing, atoms bumping and neurons firing. Science cannot give any kind of explanation for metalogic, and metalogic is the very thing that science assumes. So we need an account for the very things that it's operating on. Next, when we speak of things like progress or complexity, or when we speak of change, or when we speak of one example of a species being more fit than another, these are actually qualitative value judgments. Progress, complexity, fittest are metaphysical terms and claims. They are not simply token claims or something that's a brute factuality that immediately presents itself to our senses. Those are, again, value judgments. Value judgments involve interpretive frameworks based on objective principles. Progress, quote unquote, is not what's being observed. You're observing flux phenomena in your worldview. Progress requires some kind of objective benchmark by which you can judge this as progress, and therefore it's a metaphysical idea. So what is the benchmark, again, by which one state of affairs passing to another state of affairs counts objectively in the world as progress? The next, the last two here I have is the problem of the one and the many. This is a question as old as Plato. You brought up Plato a minute ago. The question of unity and diversity. Darwinian naturalism can only lead to either a form of monism or a form of dualism, as I mentioned earlier. Both are philosophical gobbledygook. We need some account for how there's real distinction in the world, and yet at the same time real unity in the world. You may say that's outside the purview of science. However, when you speak about a species and when you speak of a particular member of that species, you're utilizing the principle of the one and the many. And if those distinctions aren't real in the world, objectively, then you're going to either be a monist or a dualist. Being and becoming are dialectics in most worldviews, and that is a metaphysical issue. When Darwinian naturalism and Darwinian theory exalts becoming to the exclusion of being or objective principles, the problem of identity again emerges. How do we claim that that object is the same object over time when everything is ultimately flux? Telos is rejected again, generally, in this worldview. I don't know if you particularly reject telos or purpose, but the question of meaning is central in all of this. Meaning and purpose must, in most Darwinian naturalist worldviews, be subjective and projected onto reality by man's finite mind. This means meaning is completely transitory and ultimately meaningless. Further, this faux version of meaning itself is also subject to constant flux and change, and not fixed or objective or in any way eternal. Is the evolution, quote unquote, here cosmic? If it is, then I ask the question of what does that mean? What does it mean to say that evolution is a universal principle? That's not something scientifically observed. So in other words, our debate presupposes a world with fixed meaning. Meaning must be able to be conveyed from one mind to another, or our debate is itself meaningless. And all your argumentation is meaningless as well. Are your arguments subject to constant flux? Is the scientific method subject to constant flux and evolution? I'm not asking about scientific theories. I'm asking about the scientific method itself. Is it objective or is it subject to constant flux? How do we know that the scientific method is true? These are, I think, the central questions, and in conclusion, I believe that there are ethical problems, and I'm not meaning to get into the social impact of it. That's not where I'm going. But with Darwinian theory, ethically, we have to raise the question of how do we understand or know any kind of moral truths or principles in this worldview or in your worldview? How do we know that murder is wrong? How do we know that, how do we know that one should do what is true or should adhere to what is true? What conditions and causes and is the basis for the ought in your worldview? So those are my main problems, and I will now defer to you.
All right, well, that was pretty good, but most of it doesn't apply to me just because I'm not a determinist. I see what you said about the tautology after selection. I think that's a valid criticism. I agree with a lot of what you said. I think that comes, once again, because you're looking at scientism. Once again, the belief that science is basically the all we need, and it's the be-all, end-all. And once again, the idea that science doesn't have metaphysics, or need metaphysics, or doesn't make any sort of metaphysical claim. Just to clarify before, when I was saying that science isn't concerned with the metaphysics, all I meant is that, you can't observe metaphysics on a corporeal level. That's all I was really trying to say. But
but I would take issue with that. I think you can. Yeah. In other words, if epistemologically, that would translate into something like the classical view of direct and indirect realism. I mean, if you can't observe metaphysical principles or truth, if you don't have a direct perception of the real, then you would have to. Historically, most people who take that view are indirect realists, and an indirect realist is presented with certain problems in regards to, again, how do you even know what things are metaphysical and what things aren't? Because if your observation does not give you metaphysical principles and truths, then how do you know what things aren't metaphysical that you can know that are true? I don't mean to sidetrack the debate. I'm just making the point that I do believe that our sense perception presents us with all kinds of metaphysical truths that can be known, and not just sense perception, but also sense perception.
That's interesting. I'll definitely think about that. That's something I need to. That's actually something I need to think over more before I just
Fair enough.
Come out on it right away. But when you talked about the transcendental argument and unifying principles and whatnot, also problem with nature's agency. Personally, I'm pretty sure I'm a panentheist, and not because I can absolutely prove it or not, but it is what I believe. I've come to understand as a coherent worldview, the most coherent worldview I've ever had. That's not to say I can prove it's completely correct, but I am a panentheist for the time being. So
let me ask you to clarify. I mean, I'm aware of panentheism, but in that view, and I would say that I too am a panentheist, but do you believe that God is personal in that view, or is this sort of like panentheism itself could mean a lot of different things?
Right. Yeah, no, as far as the personal, it's from my perspective, if God and nature are more or less one, of course, it's like you said, there's different ways of talking about it, but if they're one, then that would mean that, once again, God is ever present. As far as there being points in which God is less personal than others. I think when a lot of theists talk about a personal God, they're talking almost, it's you can pick up the phone and put down the phone. The relationship between God and man is somewhat strange and hard to quantify. My personal view, the way I look at it, it's more a matter of God being ever present, and you can become more aware of your connection, but it's not a matter of God moving or if that makes sense. So,
well, I mean, in my view, in the biblical view, man is created in the image of God, and so man's reason and man's personality are an analog or mirror the divine personality or analog. So, in other words, there's a connection there, and humans can have a relationship with that God. And what I'm asking is, is your conception more of an impersonal force that identifies God with nature, or is it something along those lines that's a personal deity?
I would call it personal in the sense that it's conscious and, has what you might call emotions and thoughts beyond ours. So yeah, I'd call it a person.
Okay. Do you believe that God is, say, omniscient and omnipresent, or what do you think about the omnis?
Well, yeah, when you're defining, when it's panentheism, pretty much that's the definition of it. It actually doesn't get much more omnipotent or omniscient than that when it's literally not just beyond the natural world or beyond the universe, but, it's within it on every different level. Omniscience, omnipotence, the whole shebang, it's all there. And, yeah.
Okay. Do you believe that there's actual distinction in God, or do you view God as a singular sort of monad, or in the Platonic type view, or what is? I mean, I get that he's personal, or this being is personal, conscious, etc. Is there any distinction in God, or is God only one?
Yeah, sure. No, because the universe itself obviously has distinction, and if the universe is within God, God is within the universe. There's different. It's the one in the many problem. It's all one system. It's one, yet it's also many at the same time. It's one of those mystical paradoxes, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But there's definitely distinction.
Okay. Do you believe that this God created? Is matter created? Is there a beginning, middle, and end, or is it just sort of an ever-flowing sort of manifestation or emanation?
I tend towards an eternal universe right now.
So is this an emanation of God? Because there is a distinction, correct? I mean, God is in some way distinct from all that is, even though I know you're saying that he pervades and that there's a presence everywhere. But is he absolutely identified with it or not?
I'm sorry, what was that? Sorry.
I understand that you're saying that God, is ever present and pervades nature. But what I'm saying is creation or matter or the world, the universe, a sort of eternally recurring manifestation of God, or is God distinct also from nature and creation and time?
No, I would say that there's also a distinct aspect, an eternal, unchanging aspect from which flux, comes outside of it.
Okay, but for you, there's not any sort of beginning, middle, and end, so no telos?
Well, from the eternal perspective, I think you would agree that God is eternal. It's beginning and end to Him. There's never beginning and end to Him. So that would be.
Well, no, I understand.
I think the universe is a part of that.
Well, I understand. I understand what you're saying from the perspective of the eternal, but I also believe that time is very real as well. And time, as humans experience it, and as we're so constituted, has a beginning, middle, and an end.
I think we experience beginning, middle, and end, but I don't think there's any. Aside from the Big Bang Theory, which I don't really agree with for various reasons, but I don't think there's any actual evidence that time and space itself has beginning and ends. We don't. You presented in your initial argument, you presented something to that effect about flux and how, if that was the case, then essentially this reality would be impossible. I need to think about that, but I don't. But yes, time as an experience is beginning, middle, and end. But there's no actual reason, to my understanding, to believe that time itself had a beginning and end. That's kind of what I'm getting at. In other words, we seem to need, as humans are so constituted. For example, when you go about using the scientific method, there's a beginning, middle, and an end to that very process. All human interaction, has a beginning, middle, and end. But the problem is that if there's not a beginning, middle, and end to the temporal experience, then beginning, middle, and ends don't really exist. Really exist. Well, no, because you can have limits. Once again, on a corporeal level, there's this distinction. So in other words, it's kind of like the numbers line. It goes infinitely on either way, but there's still distinction ingredients in between it.
But do you think you had a beginning, middle, and an end? In other words, who it is to be you. When we talk about Josh and who Josh is, I mean, you are the person who had a beginning. You grew up as a you changed and matured as a baby, and then you will go on, and then there will be a death. And so, in other words, that is what those experiences contribute to who it is to be you. So what I'm saying is, I mean, if there's not a beginning, middle, and an end in an actual metaphysical objective sense, that time does not have an actual metaphysical reality to it, and that if time itself doesn't have a beginning, middle, and an end, then there's a difficulty in understanding how, in the worldview that you presented, we would really understand change at all. In other words, how are we not back at Zeno's paradox that change is illusion?
Well, my existence, if we believe in an afterlife, essentially, then who I am, this person called Josh, obviously, phasing goes away. Obviously, that's true. But if you believe in the immortality of the soul, then there is an eternal aspect which doesn't have a beginning and an end. So, in other words, that's where the universe becomes the temporal.
Well, okay. I mean, yeah. I mean, this gets a little bit heavy, but I mean, there are different kinds of infinities. There are different kinds of eternity. So, in other words, you can have something that comes into existence and continues on infinitely. In other words, I could draw a point in space, and that point or I could draw a line, and that line potentially could continue on. It's certainly possible for something temporal to take on eternality, but in other words, a beginning point in time does not exclude the possibility of continuing on. I don't mean to necessarily get too bogged down in that, but to bring it back to sort of to home, I mean, how did you come to the view that you have? I mean, I don't mean to rebuke you or to engage in an ad hominem, but is this the view? Is this how everybody's kind of supposed to approach theism? I mean, is it just a kind of a philosophical, thinking game where we sit back and speculate about pantheism? In other words, to bring it down to home, I mean, how do you know what's right and wrong? I mean, on what basis do you believe in any kind of, objective moral values?
Okay, well, that's like three different big questions. To explain as far as kinetism goes, I guess I'll recount my logic exactly how I came to the conclusion it was the most coherent view that in the material world. Essentially, this is really what it came. This is kind of what started was for God to be truly omniscient, God has to experience limitation. So in other words, the whole idea of there being a wholly unified God who experiences everything, kind of like this nirvana. That's one view of God. But obviously, limitation exists in this world, which is real as well. So trying to understand how those two different views could be resolved, I came to the kind of a conclusion, more or less, that think of it this way, for God to know everything, God has to know what you are thinking and feeling at this very moment. But not just to know it from the context of everything else he knows, but you have to actually experience it as.
I understand what you're saying. I would disagree. I think there's and I don't mean to be petty, but I think there's a sort of a basic philosophical mistake in that line of reasoning, because that line of reasoning would lead to the conclusion that for God to be God, to be omniscient, God would have to have direct experiential knowledge of what it is to be evil. Once we say that God is experientially knowledgeable of evil, then we have erased any objective basis for right and wrong. So the answer to that is that God does not have the meaning of omniscience is not that God has to existentially experience every possibility, because we would not say that the meaning of omnipotence is that God has to be able to erase himself out of existence, or else he doesn't exist. I mean, once we adopt that conclusion, it leads to all kinds of absurdities. Things like, well, God has to know what it's like to not exist. Well, I mean, that doesn't really make any sense. Nor does it make any sense to say that God has experiential knowledge of something like doing evil. So the solution is that that's just simply not the meaning of omniscience or omnipotence. There's nothing wrong with saying that God has a discursive knowledge of evil, or has a discursive knowledge of what it is to experience finitude. But again, we in our view as theists, holding to the biblical view, would not say that God has experiential knowledge of those things. He has discursive knowledge of those things.
Right. I guess I come more from the Eastern line of thought, and as far as God experiencing or doing evil, I'll just come out and say it. I don't have a problem with that. Not because the idea doesn't bother me, but I guess it's pretty simple to me when you look at the existence of evil in the universe itself. And then of course this goes of course into the problem of evil. And that's a whole other rabbit trail. But when I look at nature, common Western views try to essentially divide what we see and say, well, there's good and bad, things we like and things we don't like. So therefore, you must have two different sources because we don't. Resolving those two different things, the aspects which are cruel and painful, we don't like the idea that the supreme being can actually be decreeing it, not just in the sense of we messed up and now we fell and it's not God's fault in any way. I personally believe that's supposed to be to say that if God is truly in control of everything, truly in control, then not that's the thing. This is also where it resolves determinism, the sense of what are things that are being done by agents that go against God? Well, if all agents essentially are incarnations of God, and that essentially, in my opinion, resolves the paradox of free will versus theistic determinism, essentially. If all agents are essentially embodiments of divine will, the will to power, so-called, or whatnot, that, I think, provides a lot of...
So all events, how are you not a determinist then?
Well, the thing is, when it comes to what we experience in this particular world, this also gets kind of weird in terms of the fourth dimension and whatnot, in terms of different possibilities being available. And how our particular... Okay. Is it wrong to rape, kill, and steal? And how do you know that that's wrong? Just very simple. I personally do not have a theory of absolute morality right now. Not right now.
Do not have what?
I do not personally have a theory of absolute morality right now.
Okay.
So, I can absolutely make arguments from a social perspective. Well, this is actually something else. When it comes to Darwinism, you're going to go back around to the original.
Well, no. The last part of my Darwinian critique philosophically is ethical. I mean, how in that view do you have any sense of right and wrong?
Right. Well, once again, Darwinism cannot, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to Darwinism, proving certain metaphysical claims, it has metaphysical presuppositions, of course. You argue that we can empirically experience metaphysical truths, which I find interesting. I'll think about more. When it comes to absolute morality, I personally don't see how empiricism could prove absolute morality, but evolution does provide perspective on things like survival, things like social order, what we call good and evil. One of the most interesting I found is RK selection theory, and what that essentially is how organisms. So if you look up and down the lower tree of life and upper tree of life, at the bottom, or the earlier organisms, you have extremely selfish. Essentially, the method of reproduction and survival is just to spread your genes as wide as possible, eat whatever you can, and those organisms have very, very short, brutish, painful lives, basically. Most of what they do is just utter waste. When you move up this ladder, so the bottom is called R selection, upper is called K selection. You find these organisms being more compassionate, and they live longer. So there's a definitive connection between cooperative. I understand and survival.
I understand what you're saying, but what I want to know is why anyone should or should not follow any of those principles. Why should one be compassionate? Why should organisms strive to survive? Why should not other organisms strive to wipe out all organisms?
From an absolute perspective, basically, you don't have to do what's in your own interest, but you could say logically it's contradictory to say you want to have a happy life, a good productive life, and then you go around doing things that live by the sword, die by the sword, as they say. So I can say there's no logical argument in
Well, no, actually,
contradictory behaviors.
well, actually, why would that be logically contradictory? I mean, in other words, why should anyone strive to have a happy life? And by the way, what constitutes happy? By the way, that's again a qualitative value judgment.
And no, like I said, I can't provide an absolute you ought to do this, you ought to do that. But I can say that when somebody's complaining about how much their life sucks, they're not thinking rationally about their own behaviors.
Okay.
And they're saying that they have certain desires that want to be fulfilled, and yet they act against them.
Right.
I can logically point out, and I can say there's inconsistency in your worldview.
Okay.
So, and that could be a potential, that could potentially become a metaphysical ought if we really thought it through and fleshed it out. I just haven't done that yet.
Okay,
I've been trying to.
Okay, there is an issue though that I'd like to bring up also, because you seem to be, you're willing to say that there may not be in my understanding at this point necessarily objective moral issues of right and wrong, but I can logically point out a contradiction in saying you want to survive and then going out and maybe murdering a bunch of people or killing yourself. That would be contradictory. Well, there's an issue because there's not a sharp divide between something ethical and something epistemological or metaphysical. In other words, the three are bound up together, and I think you can show that you can show that logically, that one will necessitate the other two. So, for example, when you say that it's logically contradictory to say that you want, or to believe that you want to survive and flourish and be happy and then kill yourself, that assumes that one should follow what's logical. And when you say that one should follow something logical, you're again imposing a moral obligation.
That's a good one.
So in other words, truth claims impose their own assumed moral ought.
Right. No, I hear you, man. Like I said before, I'm not at a point. Now, you're catching me at a time where I'm not where like I said before, I'm just somebody who likes to think a lot.
That's fine. That's fine.
So, I don't have some absolute moral theory for, and I'm working on it. I know I'll get it right someday.
Okay, well that's fine. But I'm not trying to I'm not trying to expect more than can be expected. But the point, though, is that, I understood you to say that you do believe in objective truth and objective principles. But once you say that there's not necessarily an objective morality or an objective right and wrong, we are then also presented with a problem as to how there can be objective truth or objective principles based on the argument I just gave.
Okay.
In other words, do you believe in objective truth?
Yeah, sure. I believe that there are realities regardless of whether or not we believe or experience them.
Okay, are those objective truths or principles, universally the case? Something like,
certain truths are universal, certain truths are temporary. For instance, and there's the flux of the universe, the things that are true, and then
right.
And if time persists, and they're still true because they happened in the past. But you know what I mean? There's things which are truth is true always before, but the position of the planet Mars in respect to everything else.
Okay.
It's only an instant.
Right, and the argument I'm making is that claim necessitates also a moral claim that's universal, because right, because when you say that something is universally true, assumed in that is that everyone is on some level bound to what is objectively true in terms of adhering to that.
Right. No, I can see what you're saying there. I don't see how.
Right, but what I'm saying is that if you deny that there's objective moral truth, then you also have to throw out objective truth. Period. Because the two are claims that will necessitate one or the other.
Right. Just to be clear, I'm not denying absolute morality of moral truth. I'm just saying I'm not going to pretend that I understand it in such a way that I could logically prove some absolute moral system. system. That's all.
I understand that. But I'm saying it's it's the horns of a dilemma in the sense that to deny any universal moral claim also brings with it the unfortunate denial of objective truth.
Okay, well, I can roll with that. I mean, like I said, I'm not denying that there's absolute morality. I'm just,
Right, but
I'll
if
take that under advisement.
okay, fair enough. But if there's not objective truth, then I mean, is that a position that you're willing to adopt? That there's not any objective truth?
Oh no. For the sake of argument from now on, like I said, for the sake of argument from now on, we'll posit absolute morality, and so we can keep absolute truth. And, yeah.
Okay, and but again, I think that is a sort of a weakness in the position as a whole, in the sense that Darwinian theory, I don't think meshes well with the kind of metaphysical principles and truths that you're wanting to hold to, simply by the fact that it is a theory that emerges that is ultimately geared towards getting rid of metaphysical truths and principles. It historically is based on flux and atomism and materialism. I know that not every Darwinian theorist has been an atomist or a materialist. I know that there are theistic evolutionists. I'm aware of all that. But what I'm saying is that, generally speaking, it tends to carry the baggage of denying all of these very things that you seem to want to hold on to. So in other words, if you're willing to admit a lot of these metaphysical things that I've brought up, and in the philosophical presentation that I gave, the questions that I had with Darwinism and Darwinian theory, I still think there are some of those questions that we haven't really seen an answer to in terms of, does Darwinian evolutionary theory stand up to philosophical inquiry?
Well, I think what I said before about how I think about a lot of your reputation is like more of just scientism and doesn't. Well, certain aspects of it did deal specifically with Darwinism.
A couple of my arguments dealt with scientism, but I mean the majority of these arguments, of the 15 or so points that I presented, are not questions of scientism. They're questions of philosophical worldview questions. They're questions of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics.
Right. Yeah, but I guess my point is, like I said, a lot of it, whether my view as a pantheist is correct or not, whether my own transcendental, my thinking is transcendental to a point, not nearly as developed as yours, but so a lot of the things your charges you're making, are perfectly valid against people who actually think that way. I'm just saying personally, I don't, and I can't defend. I'm not going to try to defend some of the things that you went up against. It's simply because I don't believe them. Now, as far as how certain aspects such as metaphysics are compatible with Darwinian theory, being a reality, when it comes to things like your tautology of natural selection, well, we already talked about agency and whatnot. Let's see. Okay, here's a good one. Basically mechanistic thinking and predictions and whatnot. I guess to make this more transcendental, and how determinism simply doesn't work, and you're correct in that, because we can only. That's the thing about empiricism. Empiricism has almost disproven determinism because we found we can only predict things up to a certain point, especially on the subatomic level with quantum mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems as if everything is limited according to natural parameters,
mm-hmm.
but it's driven by some sort of innate will. And I guess my point is the limitations of science are very, very real, and you're completely correct about them. But that's also necessary for science, meaning that the limitations is kind of like you put blinders on a horse, or limited its view to keep it focused on what it's trying to find. And science, that's what science very much is. And that's why, of course, the scientific worldview doesn't work. The materialist worldview doesn't work. You're totally correct that it's all almost a bunch of bunk. I totally agree with that. But that's my point, is that it's just
Okay,
Whether we
but
evolved-
see, again, I've not seen in this, in our discourse, justification as to how it meets that criterion. Let me give you an example. Darwinian theory posits that things like the eye developed over, a couple million years. The eye, of course, is very complex. Now, I'm not making a complexity argument. I'm going to make a different argument here. In terms of the survival of the fittest, the species over time adapt and adopt develop things like the eye because they help the life form to get ahead, to survive, to become fit. So the eye was developed because it helped that species to do whatever. The question I have is, if the eye developed over millions of years, what good does a species get from 1/3 of an eye, from 0.05% eye? What good does a 1/3 wing do a species? What good does half of a leg do a species? In other words, I'm not just making the argument of transitionary fossils. I'm asking a different argument as to how do half eyes, how do half legs benefit a species?
Well, better than no legs and eyes at all. But I think that goes back to irreducible complexity, and essentially, we know that there's such thing as more primitive eyes. You look at, even things like bacteria, they have light sensors.
Okay.
Extremely primitive.
No. But see, again, you're working on the assumption that because those kinds of life forms have not very good eyesight, that therefore that's a primitive form of eyesight. In other words, you can't assume. That's again a version of the tautology. You can't assume that. The Darwinian narrative of how things came about with the tree of life is true, and so therefore the eyes that are weak in earthworms or whatever are primitive life forms or primitive forms of eyes. I mean, in other words, how are you going to prove that is a primal form of eye, and my eye is a later developed form of eye?
Right. Well, according to Darwinian theory, when we talk about primitive forms and whatnot, we're really just comparing them to ourselves. And once again, that's it's more of an objective perspective. Darwin, he had no perspective on, or he had nothing to say about absolute survivability. In other words, it was really a matter of how well you fit your own niche. So when I say primitive, I'm pointing out the fact that we have plenty of examples of, not every eye has to be, not every light sensing organ has to be as complex as ours. So when you say things like, look at half an eye, it's not like there was some point in which we just had half, and then recently we've got the whole thing, and now it works as one thing.
Well, no, that is how it is, because the development of the eye took millions of years according to standard Darwinian theory. And what I'm asking is, how is how is a barely functioning eye advantageous to a species? In other words, you're saying, well, it's better than none. Well, not necessarily. I mean, half of a limb does not necessarily constitute an advantage to a species any more than some sort of deformity.
Well, the whole point of Darwinian evolution is that there's no distinct or absolute perspective between. This once again is purely it's trying to be purely materialist, but it's not talking about. Darwin, I think, is the true freaks of nature, meaning that it's not a matter of it's not a chain of being. There's no objective or absolute direction in which organisms are trying to evolve. They simply acquire features, and either they prove to be advantageous or they don't. And once again,
I'm aware of that.
So if you and your fellow organisms, if you're having legs,
whoa. No. I'm sorry, that's incorrect. My understanding is that when you talk about what's the fittest, and when you talk about progress, and when you talk about complexity. Again, those are value judgments that are metaphysical. They are not things that can be divorced from the quote chain of being. Now, you might want them to be, but those are metaphysical claims. Those are not things that you can just sort of pass off as, well, that's not, that's not something objective.
You could say it's metaphysical, but Darwin also meant it situationally. Meaning, once again, as in a human being the most evolved, but unless, if you take a human being thrown into a volcano, survival. When Darwin said was meant the fittest, he meant how well something fits into its habitat. So in terms of
right.
Now, you can thrive all sorts, and there are people who even Darwinist scientists and whatnot who get very political about evolution, and they bring all sorts of their own metaphysics to it, and they have essentially a great chain of being and whatnot. Notions of progress and everything. But Darwin's mechanistic model, he wasn't talking about absolute progress. He wasn't. It's not that he didn't believe it, but as a naturalist, that's not what he was ultimately concerned with. He was concerned with algae organisms.
No. He talks about the favored races. I mean, now you know what the title of the book is.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm asking a different question. I'm asking how do you know that the weak eyes of an earthworm are an older form of eyes that we have? How do you know that?
Oh, well, no, they're not older because we don't descend from earthworms. They're just examples of.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that at some point in our in our lineage, we would have had weak eyes, right? And we would have at some point been creatures that were developing some form of weak eye form. And what I'm saying is, how do you know that that's what that's what happened in the past? And the only thing that you can do is point to the homologies and say that, well, we can look at these kinds of life forms, and they have weaker eyes, and so that we can then hypothesize and project that somewhere along the line, our species had, was in the process of developing this weaker eye, this nascent eye.
That goes back to basic science that I talked about before.
Yeah, but you didn't answer the questions that I had about how you're assuming the Darwinian interpretive framework, and I'm asking you, how do you know that is the case? Because I raised several questions when you. Let me pull it up again. I've got it here. When you said that we know these things are true based on the transitionary forms, based on the patterns that are there, based on the homologies, based on the shared chromosomes, based on the similarities between apes and humans, etc., I'm asking you, how do you know that those are common descent and not the creation of a deity, right?
Yeah, like I said before, the ERBs for me were the kicker. So
say what?
Okay, we know the ERBs, the viral changes in our genetic code. That's not. We know that those things. We know that these ERBs markers come from viruses. And you could say, well, maybe God made us with these ERBs, but that's like saying, well, maybe we never experienced. That's like saying maybe we never experienced the past. It was just something that got uploaded into our brains.
No, not at all. That's of course what I would argue. I mean, again, I mean, how is it? Again, I mean, the way we're going to interpret the evidence is going to be based on our presuppositions. So when you see that, you see that as evidence of common ancestor and common descent. And what I'm saying is, again, that's just a question of presuppositions. How on what basis do you know that it's not the case that that God made us that way?
Well, if you're asking for absolute knowledge, I'd be making some absolute statement.
I'm not even asking for absolute knowledge. I'm asking simply that, why should we prefer that theory to this other theory when, the host of metaphysical questions and issues and problems and presuppositions that I've given, I think show more foundational problems with that view, with the Darwinian view.
No, I take the Darwinian view because, once again, accept by the scientific method. And you can still debate whether or not it's true. And once again,
how does the scientific method show you that an answer to that metaphysical question that proves common descent? How does the scientific method show you that the ERBs prove common descent?
Because we use it all the time with great success and things like
No. I'm not asking you whether the scientific method works. I'm saying how does it prove that claim?
Well, if the only form of proof you would be able to accept would be if we actually flew back in time and watched everything that ever happened to empirically directly observe it. Then we'll never have that sort of evidence. But we have the best evidence you could possibly ask for considering our situation. That's why evolutionary theory is the predominant.
Well, that sounds like more of an interpretive narrative or framework.
No, it is. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that it's a framework. It's a theory. That's what a theory is. But the point is, once again, we use theories according to their predictive value. And, but again, we make assumptions. Once again, we make assumptions.
Yeah, I want to know. I know, but I want to know how that assumption is proven or demonstrated correct from the hypothesis. And you're just saying because the scientific you're saying that because the scientific method is reliable. I'm not asking but I'm not asking about predictive power and probability. I'm asking how the scientific method shows you that claim is correct, that we have a common descent based on ERVs. And I'm saying there's no logical necessity for me to accept that claim. In other words, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow from the scientific method and probability and the accuracy that scientists have had using scientific method for different theories that therefore ERVs prove common descent.
So this basically is a purely philosophical thing. It's not a scientific.
Well, I don't understand. I don't buy that. I don't believe in that distinction. Absolutely not. No. Again, there's no such thing as science that operates outside of logic. I mean, logic is the presupposition of the scientific method. That's what induction is. Induction is a form of reasoning. The science is the inductive method, right? The scientific method is the inductive method, right?
Well, I guess my question for you would be, how does your worldview help science? In other words, what is it? Because essentially, what this comes down to is we have scientists set up certain expectations, meaning if evolution is true, here's what we expect to see, and they tested it. Okay, so my question to you is, and I totally admit it, man, that they make assumptions. Okay.
I know, and I'm not right, but and again, that's not the point that I'm disputing here. I'm just simply saying I don't see why there's some necessity or some logical force of argumentation for me to accept that because of ERVs that there is therefore common descent. I mean, there's
okay, I would say that when you accept other scientific theories that employ the same scientific method that evolution does, once again based upon observation.
That's again a non sequitur. I mean, the scientific method is used by people that have all kinds of different views. So simply the fact that certain people use the scientific method that have a Darwinian view has absolutely nothing to do with the scientific method proving that ERVs mean common descent.
Scientific method. Okay. Once again, when it comes to people having fringe scientific views that I don't buy into, for instance, still the question remains is, does it actually follow the scientific method? That's how so-called scientific views I don't agree with are disproven, is once again by the scientific method. So I know there's such a thing as this, you mentioned in your video, there's no monolithic thing called science that we can just believe and trust. And I agree there, but once again, when it comes to things like, we brought up phonology and how phonology has been, was called a science, but it was disproven by science because it didn't follow the scientific method correctly.
Right. But again, the scientific method as a logical structure, as a tool, and in its presupposition and usage of logical and metaphysical principles itself does not demonstrate or prove that the existence of ERVs means common descent.
Okay, so what evidence, you believe that you and I share common descent, right? And we're both human beings.
Right.
Would you base that on any evidence aside from just scripture, which essentially says that humans are all common descendants? Mm-hmm. Do you have any scientific perspective on that? Is there anything you would use as evidence to explain that?
Oh, absolutely. I think all the things that we talk about only make sense in my worldview. I think that belief in the scientific method, again, that induction is a principled, objective reality that we can believe that the future will be like the past, only makes sense if reality is created and if there's a God that providentially and in his sovereignty rules over that created reality. In other words, an omniscient deity is the basis for believing in induction. God says that through Noah that the seasons will be will proceed in succession. Genesis 1 talks about God creating and ordering the stellar and lunar creation so that it will regulate the seasons. So in other words, that to me is a better explanation and a rational, completely sensible one for how we can have predictive power, how we can have probability, how we can have invariant logical entities like numbers or like laws of logic, as opposed to the opposing position, where I don't understand how, in your view, we would have things like objective principles. Because on the one hand, you seem to say, well, there is a deity, it's a panentheistic deity, it's a conscious deity. However, we don't yet know if there's objective morality or necessarily if there's objective, absolute proof of anything.
Well, that's my personal. I'm just being honest about where I'm at right now in my own intellectual life. But okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think it's when you brought up all these things about you're on epistemology and you're unifying principles and whatnot. I don't see how that in any way excludes evolutionary theory from being possible in terms of anything you just said as far as epistemological knowledge induction. Just because evolutionary theorists do not provide you with their own complete worldview.
Again, you're wanting to you're wanting to constrict the scientific method to a localized, specific tool, and I agree with that. But what I'm trying to tell you is that at the same time, that's not what almost all Darwinian theorists do. And I don't think you've done that in the course of our debate even. And you've not been, I don't believe, consistent in, only having the scientific method tell you about certain phenomena and hypotheses. I think you are tacking on all throughout all kinds of big metaphysical claims that I don't see justified in the scientific method.
Well, because once again, I'm not representing purely. I'm not here to represent pure Darwinism. That's the whole point.
But you keep saying that you're only interested in defending the scientific method and Darwinian theory in this debate. That's what the debate's over. And what I'm saying is, this is all packed with a bunch of metaphysical baggage, and you're saying, well, that's okay. I don't have a problem with that, but I'm only here to defend, the scientific method. Well, no, that's my challenge to you is, I want an understanding on how, if supposedly Darwinian theorists and Darwinian naturalists and evolutionary theorists are only going to present to me something that's a specific, localized hypothesis on, ERVs, how then that translates into a grand narrative or huge metaphysical claim about common descent. And that's what I'm saying is completely unconvincing. It's wanting to play two sides of the coin. It's wanting to say, well, no, I'm only concerned with scientific method and using scientific inquiry and theory, and then turning around and making a whole bunch of metaphysical baggage claims.
Well, once again, of course I have metaphysical beliefs, and of course scientists have their own metaphysical beliefs as well.
Okay, right, but the metaphysical beliefs are more foundational than the discursive, inductive, scientific claims. That's my point.
Right. I guess my point is I'm not going to claim to have a total, complete worldview that will explain every epistemological issue out there. I'm not going to claim that. But once again,
I'm not right, and I'm not asking you.
You've been bringing up how evolutionists don't provide, or even ordinarily that they have contradictory views, that they have incompatible ideas, incompatible metaphysics, and so on. And I'm not going to say that any of that's silly and untrue.
Well, no, I've given you specific examples and specific things that you defended.
Just a minute.
Okay.
What I don't see from you, though, is exactly how I haven't heard you say anything about how your metaphysics precludes the possibility of evolution. In other words, once again,
it precludes it on the basis of a presuppositional critique of its assumptions.
Okay.
So
that makes sense.
I have been attempting to make a series of transcendental arguments against it, and a transcendental argument is done indirectly, and so it reduces to a reductio. For example, sorry about that. When Aristotle, for example, argued against the sophists, he said that when the sophists when the sophists argued against the principle of non-contradiction, or the law of non-contradiction, they assumed the law of non-contradiction. That, therefore, is a foundational presuppositional flaw or contradiction in their view. And being that it's so foundational and so massive in its implications to deny the law of non-contradiction while assuming it, that actually constitutes one of the strongest forms of argumentation. In other words, in my view, in my argument, I think that the presuppositional flaws in that approach and in the worldview that we've been examining and presenting are so fundamental, so foundational, and so wide sweeping that they make the view itself pretty much gobbledygook.
Okay, so essentially you're saying that the only person who can prove evolution to you or disprove your position is someone who has an equally comprehensive and fleshed out, full deal worldview, essentially. Everything from metaphysics, divinity, free will, mechanism, naturalism, understanding all these things completely in full and having a full worldview. That's only the type of perspective that can actually persuade you, essentially.
Well, I think all those things are valid, but I'm not just saying that that one has to answer every possible question. I'm saying that in the claims that are made and are assumed for that worldview, that they're so foundationally flawed that there's nothing convincing about the view.
Okay, but maybe I'm just super tense, not seeing how your criticisms of so-called Darwinian worldview is any different than just the criticism of scientism in general. And my point is that, once again, science, the method, makes assumptions, and there are limitations, and scientists who don't understand the assumptions they're making and acknowledge those limitations, they're making a big mistake.
Yeah,
and
you're just...
It is incredibly common, but that doesn't change the fact, once again, if they're operating inside the scientific method, and once again, you're bringing up criticisms which can be applied just as much to heliocentricity. I mean, things like assumptions, things like epistemological frameworks.
Again,
how many
I'm not making the argument that it's wrong because it makes assumptions. I'm saying that it has conflicting assumptions.
I know, but my point also is that you can find an astronomer who has slightly conflicting assumptions, but he's still just as good at his job of astronomy because he follows the scientific method. That's what keeps his results, in my opinion, valid. because you're never going to find.
Why should I believe a Darwinian theorist's argumentation about something that is a grand narrative that goes beyond the scientific method when his own presuppositions conflict with what he believes about the scientific method and about metaphysics? It's, in other words, it's a foundationally flawed argument and worldview.
But the neo-Darwinist scientist or Darwin himself?
Well, I'm mainly concerned with arguing against the position that you're defending. So I'm not necessarily arguing against every single person. I'm interested in the arguments that you've presented so far. And what I'm saying is that I've not heard any argumentation that is convincing for Darwinian theory. All I've heard is that you continue to restate that you believe in the scientific method, and that the scientific method is not geared towards answering these big questions. Again, what I've heard from you is argumentation to prove Darwinism based on the scientific method that goes beyond the scientific method. And I don't. And again, the presuppositions at work here don't comport with one another.
Okay. So you're saying that because evolution implies a sort of a metaphysic in terms of recognizing patterns and coming up with
yes,
and coming up with a pattern, that therefore it violates the scientific method, or moves outside of it because it obstructs, because the mere fact it disrupts the narrative.
There's no such thing as a neutral approach to reality by which I can simply use the scientific method without any presuppositions or without any rose-colored glasses or without any beliefs that condition my use and interpretation of the scientific method. Scientific method,
totally.
Right. So if that's the case, then you just reiterating and saying that you're only defending the scientific method and its results, and the scientific method proves Darwinism, is not answering my claim. It's not answering my charge.
Okay, I would say that your charge, if it comes down to the fact that because Darwinism because it makes metaphysical claims.
A host of them.
Yeah, sure. Of course. So it makes metaphysical claims, but then it claims to be purely scientific. You're saying that's we'll just get down to it. It's fundamental problem you have with it, that it says it's science, and then it makes metaphysical claims, right?
And on top of that, it makes claims and has presuppositions that are completely contradictory.
Okay. Once again, like I said before, this was back to earlier discussion at the beginning, how even things like heliocentricity, that is a narrative, that is a story, that is metaphysical. It is meta. We're talking about connections, talking about all sorts of assumptions, and I know I keep going back to assumptions. The point is, but you're not criticizing heliocentricity because it's metaphysical.
Again, ERVs and their existence and the scientific method do not necessitate, there's no logical force behind that there's a common descent. That's an interpretive framework that I'm supposed to adopt. And what I'm saying is I don't see any logical force behind that claim for me to go outside of that and then adopt a metaphysical bunch of baggage and narrative.
Okay, so
in other words, that argument has no force that I can see.
Okay, I'm not going to try to do a logical syllogism. I'll do that as soon as it's done here, of course. I'm going to try to. I'll give you one right now because that would just take some thought, and I have to criticize myself first.
Mm-hmm.
But once again, there's still it's more than just a logic. Like there's experiential information.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but
you're saying isn't that something you could experience or just a witness that would you understand how the science of if Parker's did valid science and can tell us about common descent. My point is if legal courts will use genetic markers to convict criminals, send them to jail, even kill them, or to assign paternity to certain people, if this system, I'm not trying to make an appeal to popular opinion. My point though is that this system is so trusted, and there's ways of looking into testing this, understand if it's a valid method of determining how the world works.
Well, no, I mean,
if you understand that genetic markers can tell us by credibility, why would you exclude that science from, once again, if
I'm not excluding genetics. I'm not excluding genetic markers. I'm saying that it's a question of the interpretation of those genetics and genetic markers.
Well, sure it is. But once again, we interpret things based upon previous experience. And if my
Well,
experience,
right, but we don't
if
just.
my experience is that genetic markers can be used to convict criminals, prove compatibility time and time again, then my experience, then my experience, of course, applies to when someone points out the similarities to chimps. There's no reason for me to draw an arbitrary boundary.
Well, there's no reason for me to accept that in the past. You're talking about future predictability. I don't have a problem with future predictability based on common genetic markers and similarities, because I don't have a problem saying God created monkeys and he created men. That makes perfect sense in my worldview or web of beliefs. But what I'm saying is there's no logical force for me to accept, based on what you've said about similarities, that's something in the distant past that proves common descent.
But it's still all the distant past, meaning that when the term of paternity, they say this guy, he fought this child, and they compare the genes. Well, I mean, the sex happened in the past. The child was conceived in the past. So
yeah, but that's a false.
How does it prove?
It's a false analogy, because you're going from genetic markers of crime traits in humans that we've observed in recent past to making a claim about something millions and billions of years ago that no one has any possibility of observing. How much?
But it's still the past. There are still things that are not observed in courts.
Has anyone observed the something that happened millions or billions of years ago?
Aside from the organisms there, no.
And we have no access to that observational knowledge of those organisms there. So, again, the force of this argument, one of the main points that you gave, you said what was the kicker for you was the ERVs. And I'm saying, where is the force, where is the strength in this argument that I'm supposed to accept that this is what happened in the aeons of ages ago? I'm saying that it's a non sequitur. And you can say, well, I'm not interested in necessarily formulating a strict syllogism at this time. Well, I mean,
I'm interested in that. I will, but I'm just saying I'm not going to put down the phone and give you, for 10 minutes.
Well, you're not going to be able to construct a strict syllogism that has logical force for something that's observed. That's an observational theory of the past. That's impossible.
An observational theory of the past. No, I'm not claiming. Once again, I'm not claiming to understand to observe the past. My point is that I apply what I know as scientifically as I can, which is, once again, science is based upon observing, noticing patterns, and then, yes, making a so-called assumption that the past still applies.
None of that is observed. So where's the force in that? None of what's happened billions of years ago is observed.
Well, we can predict what we'll find about millions of years ago, or whenever.
Well, but those predictions are conditioned upon something that I believe is completely compatible. I mean, God made us that way. That's why it's predictable. In other words, so what that you make predictions? That doesn't prove that the metaphysical claim of something billions of years ago is correct.
So, how would you metaphysically
the accuracy of the probability has nothing to do with what happened billions of years ago. There's no reason to logically force me to accept billions of years ago, common descent with the claims that you're making about genetic markers. There's just, where is the logical force there?
How would you then metaphysically prove something like, and maybe you have an answer, I'm not trying to be snarky here. I'm really curious. How would you metaphysically prove, or logically prove, as you said, that Abraham Lincoln existed? In other words, you'll be pointing to evidence. Once again, there's all these assumptions, assuming that the letters weren't forged. You're assuming.
Well, that's it's a bad analogy, because there were conscious humans there that were able to observe, and so I believe that we have what's called. But listen, I believe what we have is called a warranted belief in looking at and interpreting written accounts of people who knew Abraham Lincoln. That's a fully justified and warranted belief. You're asking me to believe in something that no one has ever observed and is simply an interpretive framework based around something that goes beyond. It's an interpretive framework that goes beyond the claims of the scientific method.
You observe speciation all the time. You can say that's fine.
I'm not asking about observing speciation. I'm asking why I'm supposed to believe in common descent based on ERV. You said that was the kicker for common descent.
Well, I guess fundamentally for me, it's because we use common descent to accurately prove. We use ERVs to accurately prove common descent in the present day world. And I don't see any particular reason why it would not apply to the past.
Well, so in other words, it's a presupposition that you have. You have the presupposition that when you right, and I'm
as I said, I totally admit that. It is an assumption. It's a working assumption. It's an assumption which again gives us predictive results. I have no reason.
No. That's not what's giving you predictive. Common descent is not what's giving you predictive results, because that's again a.
There's where you're wrong. There's where you're wrong. Once again, it does. I brought that up before about how they use evolution to find new species in the fossil record. They use it all the time. It's predictive power. I mean, when I say
you're assuming that the narrative structure that it has about the past is what's given it its accuracy and its predictive power. And I'm saying that narrative could be completely wrong. My narrative could be completely right. So just, again, it's a tautology for you to refer to, well, the way that we know that common descent is correct is because common descent is what gives us accuracy in predictive hypotheses of what's going to happen in the future. Well, that just assumes predictive descent. That just assumes common descent. And what we were looking for is a proof for common descent. We're not looking for why you presuppose common descent. I want to know the proof for it. And you said the proof for it was because of ERVs. And ERVs and the scientific method do not demonstrate common descent. Or at least you've not yet shown where the force of that argument is. You just keep saying that because of predictive power. It's common descent because of predictive power.
Predictive power is more or less why I believe everything dealing with the material world.
Yeah, that's a big metaphysical claim that's not proven by the scientific method. So, in other words, the Darwinian theory that was the strongest argument was ERV, that is based on predictive power, which is a metaphysical principle that's not proven by the scientific method. So, so Darwinian theory's strongest argument of ERV and common descent is all based on a huge metaphysical principle that's not proven by the scientific method.
That's where it gets back to metaphysics, though.
I know.
You're totally correct that the scientific method comes out of metaphysical assumptions. And that's one thing I guess I'm going to.
Is it based on those?
Is science based on metaphysics?
Is the scientific method based on those metaphysical assumptions and principles?
I would call them necessarily assumptions, but yes, principles, yeah. They're based upon.
Well, when you do the scientific method, you assume logic, correct?
Sure.
Right, so it's based on it. It's an assumption. And if that's the case, then those metaphysical things are more foundational than the actual inductive claims of specific scientific experiments.
Yes.
Okay. And if that's the case, then merely giving me an inductive hypothesis about ERVs does not translate into an explanation about how there is, it does not translate into an explanation of some big, vast metaphysical claim. It can't do it. It's just not possible for that to do that.
So the issue at hand is fundamentally purely metaphysical.
Well, I just think that's a particularly strong point. It doesn't have to be. I mean, I think there are several problems, but I keep coming back to this one because it seems to be this is what you said was the strongest point.
But the ERVs.
Yeah, you said that was the kicker argument for demonstrating evolutionary theory for you.
Oh yeah, yes. Once again, as science, but now that we're actually questioning.
Yeah, but again, all you're doing is
Jay, it sounds to me almost like you're questioning the scientific method itself.
I know it sounds like that, but the reason it sounds like that is because you're not just sticking to scientific method. You keep doing it, and you keep tacking on a whole bunch of metaphysical stuff that's bigger than the scientific method.
No, my point is I have totally acknowledged that the scientific method relies upon metaphysics. And my point is that
then you can't go from the ERV claim to a big metaphysical claim because one presupposes the other one.
Okay, so are you trying to say that science can make no metaphysical claims whatsoever?
Of course not. The argument about ERV from the scientific method does not prove or justify or lead to the big metaphysical claims and assumptions that are made when you say that there's common descent. I don't see how you get from A to B, and or why I'm supposed to be logically convinced of that.
Okay, so I guess this goes back to the actual philosophy of what science is. In other words, when we observe certain things that are repeated in our lives, and we make the assumption that always be the case, it's not the same thing as a faith claim. In other words,
it absolutely is the same as a faith claim.
No, this is what I was talking about before. I talked about where I think Bill Nye dropped the ball. In other words, he was talking about certain assumptions, and he wasn't. And there's a big problem in the scientific community. I totally agree with this, that they don't even understand making assumptions. I totally get that. And so what they're talking about amounts to faith claims because they have such tremendous confidence in the results they've gotten and the predictability that essentially it becomes a faith claim. But I'm not making faith claims. What I'm trying to say here is we have working assumptions.
Working assumptions are faith claims. There's no difference.
So what was that?
I don't see it. Where is the difference between working assumptions and faith claims? How do you prove that the scientific method is? How can you you cannot scientifically prove the scientific method.
Let me think about that for a second.
And if that cannot be done, then it is a faith, a belief. It's a foundational assumption. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It means that the way you would prove it would be different than the way you would prove discursive or inductive things.
Well, if there's an assumption that the scientific method gets results, we say that we can't judge the scientific method according to my scientific method, but I would think that science itself has proven itself to get its own self results predictably.
Oh, okay. Well, then God Himself proves Himself, and that's all. And again, this is where there's no force in the argument in that kind of argumentation. I mean, what you interpret as results is going to be conditioned on your presuppositions. So, what does it even mean to get results? And once you start saying, well, it's fitting up with the theory and it's according to the principles that we laid down in the hypothesis, well, that's all a bunch of metaphysical stuff that goes beyond the scientific method.
Right. We're going in circles now. I guess my point is...
No, we're not going in circles because, I've made the point that there's no force in the argumentation of ERVs that should lead me to accept a vast metaphysical claim about something that happened billions of years ago. There's no logical connection between those 2 points. It's an interpretive framework, and you're just telling me I should accept that interpretive framework because the scientific method gets results. There's no connect between those two.
I'm saying when it comes to ERVs, I accept it because, once again, ERVs, they're used in the present day, and the scientific method relies upon the assumption that there are certain constants. And yes, it's an assumption, but that isn't. When it comes to absolute proof, once again, it's not a question of absolute proof. Even scientists themselves.
Yeah, but you keep bringing up questions that I'm not even asking you. Again, what is the force of the argumentation in the existence of ERVs that I'm supposed to accept common descent billions of years ago? Where is the connect between those 2 points? And if you just say predictability, that's not answering that question. That's. No. Like
I said, no. It's not just predictability. It's the fact that in the real world, it has, in the immediate world, it has results. It has.
I'm not asking about results. How am I supposed to get from ERVs to common descent? Where is the connect? What is the proof of that? And you just keep saying, well, we get results in the present world based on predictability. Again, that is not a proof for billions of years ago, something that no one has observed.
I guess from my point, millions of years ago for me isn't a problem for the simple fact.
But again, I want an answer to why I should accept that. I'm not asking for, statements about predictability. I want to know where the force of the argument is.
Okay. If we accept certain working assumptions of constants of things that you've observed, if in other words you say this thing keeps on happening, so it's probably always been this way. It's just a matter of probably. It's just a matter of, it's a working assumption. I'm saying if we apply that.
Well, you said this was the strongest kicker for Darwinism and common descent.
Yeah. Once again, because it's.
Well, I mean, what makes? How do you know that that's what's probable billions of years ago?
How is it probable as opposed to just?
Well, that's what you just said. That it's probable that that's what happened billions of years. How do you know that's what's probable billions of years ago?
It's not a matter of absolutely knowing.
I'm not asking if you absolutely know. I'm asking on what basis do you say that that's probable, even?
Because that's how we do all science. It's based upon.
You're just going. That's a circular argument.
It's based upon the assumption. Science is based upon the assumption of constants.
Yeah, but you're making a circular argument on this is an inductive argument that is circular. That's a fallacy. You're telling me I should accept common descent based on ERV. Why should I accept that? Because it's based on the scientific method. Why should I accept that that's the conclusion from the scientific method? Because the scientific method works. That's not a valid argument.
Well, no, not just because the scientific method works, but because evolution has passed the test as an evolutionary.
Yeah, but when I ask you what the test is for evolution, you say it's ERVs. This is a circular fallacy.
No, the test, the actual test.
You said that was the kicker argument.
Well, no, I'm saying that was how it passed. That was how it passes the test. It passes the test of predictability, and hence it maintains itself as a valid scientific theory.
And when I ask you how I'm supposed to accept common descent, which is part of the crucial central framework of this piece, you keep saying a circular argument.
Let me trace it back here. Okay. So I'm trying to understand here. I say that it meets the scientific method. And the scientific method, or Darwinism, is based upon certain metaphysical claims. This is fundamentally a metaphysical issue of epistemology.
Why am I right? Okay. Why am I supposed to right? But why am I supposed to accept that ERV means common descent? I mean, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I mean, I think it's right.
Right. Okay. Once again, I would take it back to a matter of. This is probably not going to be the be-all, end-all argument you're interested in terms of the transcendent argument, but I would actually bring it back to a matter of, just to keep it simple, consistency with yourself, meaning that there are all sorts of things which you assume are constant based upon your observations in the immediate world.
Well, but this is
and you assume that these constants have always been. I mean, we all do that. That's part of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so my argument there would simply be that, if you I don't know what your assumptions might be, but do you deny that you observe certain constants in your immediate experience, and that you?
No, of course not.
And then you just assume,
no, of course not. And God is the condition for those assumptions. But what you're telling me is that the scientific method gives me a grand narrative explanation for something that happened billions of years ago, and when I ask you why I'm supposed to accept that as the kicker argument, you're telling me because the scientific method is accurate. And that's just, it doesn't follow.
So if you're saying that you don't think the scientific method, you're saying that
I did not, of course I'm not saying I never said the scientific method does not work.
No, I correct myself. What I'm saying is, I'm asking you, are you saying I need to prove that the scientific method itself is accurate?
Again, why should I accept that ERVs mean that billions of years ago there's a common descent? And when you say because the scientific method, that's a circular argument.
Well, no, I said it's because of what we observe. I said it's because of what we do observe in the immediate.
But billions of years ago, what is billions? But you've already admitted that billions of years ago was not observed. So again, why am I supposed to accept that as the answer to ERVs? What is the force of that argument? I mean, I've asked it like 20 times, and all I've heard is, so you don't believe in the scientific method? No, I'm not asking that. I want to know what the force of that argument is.
Because it's a basic. I don't know what the philosophical term for this is. Just making assumptions of the past based upon what we've observed constantly at present time.
So induction. That's called induction.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. Obviously there's something.
So that's right. And induction is the same thing, or is what you do in the scientific method. So the scientific method shows me ERVs, and I'm supposed to believe that billions of years ago there's a common descendant because of the scientific method. That's called a circular argument.
So okay, let me think about this for a second. Well, no, I think it could be much more foundational, meaning that there is I don't see exactly how it, like, when I'm rambling on, of course it's going to sound circular, but my point is that there's the foundations of the scientific method. There's the metaphysics below it, the foundational concepts, then there's the scientific method itself, and then there's the results of it. I don't see, I'm not using ERVs to prove science. I'm saying that.
I know you're not. You're saying that you're saying it proves a big, vast metaphysical claim, and it doesn't. That's my point. And this was supposed to be, according to you, the kicker argument for Darwinism.
Well, once again, I was talking about it from a scientific perspective, but I was talking about it from a purely scientific perspective.
Okay.
I mean, that's
but see, you keep expanding and you keep narrowing it. I mean, on the one hand, it's the scientific method, and that's what I'm concerned with. Then it turns into a big metaphysical claim about billions of years ago in common descent. And how do we know that's true? Because the scientific method is only concerned with claims about ERVs. And what I'm saying is that's the fault.
I'm not claiming that there's such a thing. I'm not even claiming there is such a thing as absolute proof.
I'm not asking about absolute proof. I'm just asking about the argument that you're making as it's constructed logically is an inductive argument that makes a vast metaphysical claim about the past that then is based on another inductive argument, and that's called a circular argument.
Okay, what exactly is the assumption that I'm making and then concluding with? What did you hear me saying that's both my starting point and my end point?
That you're using the scientific method to make an inductive argument, ERVs, right? Common characteristics. That's then expanded beyond the scope to make a claim about something that is vast and metaphysical beyond the scientific method that's observable about billions of years ago in common descent, and that's based on an interpretive framework that you're assuming. And then and when I say, well, how do we know that? You're turning around and you're saying because of the scientific method, because of induction. So induction proves ERVs. ERVs prove or speak to, give some kind of evidence or proof of some kind for billions of years ago common descent. This was the strongest argument. And how do we know that? The induction, because the future acts like the past.
How is that circular?
Because you're making an inductive argument that goes to a metaphysical claim about the past, that's based on induction. Induction proves something billions of years ago based on induction. That's impossible. That's a fallacy.
Okay, so you're saying, so basically, this comes down to you don't believe that do you believe that science can't teach us about the past at all?
Say that again?
Do you believe that science can't teach us about the past?
No, of course not.
Okay. How do you propose learning about the past then?
Again, the problem with your argument is not claims about the past or claims about the future or induction. None of that is the problem. The problem is that you're asking me to accept what you conceive to be a killer argument about Darwinism based on induction that makes a claim that goes beyond induction that's then based on induction. And that's circular.
Well, I think it got me beat as far as being able to argue my way out of this. I mean, we've run out of fun a bit, so I'm not going to, pretend that I.
Well,
have what you're looking for.
Well, we can definitely have a rematch, or we do. You can formulate some more thoughts on it, or rewrite this, or whatever you want to do, and we can do another one of these. And in conclusion, if you want to give your concluding point, and then I'll give a concluding point briefly. And I think we've got a pretty good discussion here.
Well, I guess in conclusion, I would just say that I came into this fundamentally from a scientific perspective, which is what I think is one. The question of does predictive power, does it have predictive power, which is the test that's put to you at each theory of whether or not it's true. I mean, that's simply how science works. So, as far as the assumption that science can't tell us anything about the past because it's based upon induction, I'll have to do more thinking about that. Obviously, I would. Once again, I'm not saying that there's such a thing as absolute proof. I mean, there probably is such a thing as absolute proof. I'm not claiming to be able to provide it. Simply trying to come at this from a perspective that's consistent with understanding how science works. So that's pretty much all there is to it.
Okay, and I completely agree. I think that we need to strive for consistency. I just happen to think that in the totality picture, in the long run, when we look over the 14 or 15 points that I gave roughly an hour ago, I think the theistic explanation that's presented in the Bible gives us an actually coherent basis for the scientific method. I think it gives us the only coherent basis for things like logic and variant entities like mathematical truths and principles and so forth, because those are consistent with the idea of the God that's presented in the Bible. And I want to thank Josh for coming on. We want to welcome him back anytime. And I think this has been a good discussion, a good debate. We were both civil about it. Nobody was a jerk, so that was cool. And I'll try to get this posted as quick as I can, and we'll look forward to some feedback. And do you have any? I'll put the link to the Facebook profile that you mentioned. If anybody wants to get in contact with Josh and sort of collate, if they're of his opinion, they're free to. Is that cool?
Yeah, totally. And try to send me your that list of 16 or however many ones you had. I tried to write them all down, but in the course of discussion, got pretty much way off of them. I guess I wasn't expecting it to be of that nature. So yeah, I'll definitely look it over and continue to think about it, and maybe we'll come back and do this again now that I have a better understanding of what exactly the position is. I had no idea what your position was in that regard.
Well, and I wasn't totally sure about your views either. So
yeah, okay,
all right.
Well, it's been good, man.
All right, thanks, Josh.